I grew up in New York City. I guess you call it a union family. And I went to public institutions for my education, for my bachelor's. I went to the City University of New York, Queens College, and I went for graduate school. I went out to Cincinnati, to the University of Cincinnati, and went through all of those BA, MA, Ph.D. in the late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s, and back in that era was able to do all that without accruing a dollar of debt, and then became a clinical psychologist. Went into private practice in Cincinnati, Ohio there, and slowly but surely became increasingly embarrassed by what my profession had become, which was increasingly taken over by pharmaceutical companies, and this was all the mental health professions that were increasingly controlled by pharmaceutical companies to increase diagnoses, to sell more drugs. Slowly but surely I became more of I guess you would call it an activist. It just started out with letters to the editor, then articles where I was disagreeing with what was going on in my profession. And then people got a hold of me, and I joined organizations, and before you know it, I'm writing books and speaking and addressing this whole issue of America, of like there are other reasons besides genes and biochemistry why people are having such a hard time out there, and that they're not hearing truths from drug companies who are increasingly controlling the major establishments of psychiatry and psychology, and addressing the increasingly silly diagnoses that were coming through the pipe, and just leave no child left undrugged, and on and on. And so I wrote a book called Common Sense Rebellion, and got published in 2001, about this kind of connection between our institutions and this increasing mental illness disorders. One of the things that I discovered was that the population, many of the people, and in fact most of the media, were kind of on my side, that it was like sort of an emperor's new clothes phenomenon, that many other people were thinking like, wait a minute, do these kids is that really a disease, oppositional defiant disorder, or is that just kids who are stubborn and refusing to comply? Many people were thinking, is this really kind of crazy that we're drugging kids who just are not fitting in to standard school systems? Many people felt that way. So I've got a huge validation from the general public, and also too many people in the media, except for maybe the most mainstream, middle-of-the-road, centrist media. But most of the media, at least the critically thinking media on both sides, left and libertarian, many different political points of view. The good news was that there was some mental health professionals that had formed organizations, were also dissenting this, may want to call them dissonant mental health professionals, or just folks who just were embarrassed by their profession. But overall, the majority of the profession is not exactly what you call anti-authoritarian or rebellious, or even all that critical thinking when it comes to taking a look at themselves. And the next book was a book called Surviving America's Depression Epidemic, and that was really taking a look at the real reasons why people get depressed that they're not hearing from pharmaceutical companies and the sort of mainstream psychiatric establishment, which is increasingly financially controlled by the pharmaceutical companies, and also taking a look at alternative ideas and solutions, what was missing, what was not in the conversation in terms of how to deal with depression. So in other words, what were the real societal and cultural causes of it that people were not looking at, but also too, what were some of the areas that even non-drug prescribers were not really taking a look at seriously, issues around morale and healing, and how one could actually build relationships. So I was trying to take a look at a lot of areas that were being neglected by the mainstream establishment, psychiatry and psychology, in terms of dealing with depression. And it turned out, as the book evolved, and who the audience was for that book, were really a lot of critically thinking depressed people who knew that a lot of these drugs really didn't work any better than placebos, and they were had a lot of adverse effects, who had tried some of these simplistic behavioral therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, and many other different psychotherapies, and they were not effective and not helpful. And one of the things that's problematic in the whole mental health profession is an attempt to sort of ape the hard sciences. They want to only talk about quantitative issues. And these two major issues that are important in depression, morale building and healing, are decidedly non-quantitative. They're non-objective, they're non-measurable, but they're vitally important. And so one of the things the mental health establishment has tried to sell people is that there's two alternatives: to view depression as something that it's your fault, you're just lazy, irresponsible, and that's a stigma. Or their view is, we're giving you an option. We're telling you it's a disease. We're telling you it's a disorder. Therefore, in their own head, we're getting rid of the stigma of being depressed. And from my point of view, both of those are wrong. It's neither something to be stigmatized as a failing, as an inadequacy, but it's also not, there's no proof at all it's this biological disease, which for a lot of other people, my readers, that in itself was depressing. To have this idea that they've got this disease called depression and they have to be on drugs for the rest of their life. And not only was that depressing, but it's just not true. The research shows over and over again, lots of people get depressed and they pass through it. There's many people out there who use all kind of drugs, illegal drugs, psychiatric drugs. All these drugs are psychotropic drugs that affect neurotransmitters. So, for example, cocaine affects serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. If you're taking a couple of antidepressants, say like Effexor or Wellbutrin, you're affecting the same neurotransmitters. So a big goal for me is to end the hypocrisy. None of these drugs work by restoring some kind of so-called mythical chemical brain imbalance. That was a great marketing ploy. If you really want a long-term antidote that's going to build self-respect and self-esteem, a lot of it has to do with faith and belief, and you want to be careful about what you pick. And this was very appealing for critical thinkers. Those critical thinkers, by and large, have a hard time having faith in anything. And those are the same people who typical psychotherapy or antidepressants or anything didn't work on. It would be nice if there were a particular recipe for how you pull people out of vicious cycles in general. Some people can go to an AA meeting and they can walk in that door and they say to these people, like, you're going to have to let go and let God here. For some people, that just makes perfect sense, and they just grab onto that. And it's a way of getting out of their shame and their misery and their self-hatred and their feeling of inadequacy and all kinds of stuff. For other people out there, that just feels stupid. It makes no damn sense at all. It makes no sense for you to tell me that I'm powerless here, over my alcohol, but I'm supposed to do anything. And it just doesn't work. I'm much more interested in the general notion of how people get powerless and how they get oppressed and how they get overwhelmed by pain. And then I'm interested in a lot of the variety of ways that people pull out of it. Some people pull out of it, through music. Some people can, they don't need drugs at all. They can just go and listen to Pink Floyd or Beethoven or whatever. And just that energy pulls them, validates and resonates with their pain, but at the same time uplifts them. Some people would say that that's a huge component of great art, whether it's music or cinema or whatever. You get validated and you resonate with something, but somehow the artist pulls you to another place. What I care a lot about is people who are in a kind of powerless position and people who feel not only powerless, but have moved into states of passivity and immobilization. And what I care a lot about is having kind of grown up in that state and also grown up not in poverty, but grown up in working class with people who in my adult world were not a lot of folks with a lot of at least college educations, and seeing moving into the world of professionals with Ph.D.s and pundits and a world of people who viewed sort of passive people as having something either a disease or being ignorant or being stupid. Like, in other words, if this person was not doing something for themselves and they were in a depressed state, they must just not be knowledgeable enough of the greatness of mental health treatment. It's often not the case that these people are stupid or ignorant, that there's something else that has put them into a state of passivity. We can get 5 million people to demonstrate against a war, and they're going to still do it. So why even bother? It doesn't matter that all of us are opposed to these Wall Street bailouts for the very rich here, and nobody cares about poor struggling homeowners. It doesn't matter. They're in control. We have no power. That kind of sense I see increasingly, which is, makes me think about a lot of people that I see on an individual level who have moved into what psychologists call a kind of learned helplessness or in a kind of abuse situation. And so, I'm interested in powerlessness, and I'm interested in how people move into a state of passivity, but I'm mostly interested in how people move out of that, how people get out of that. And so I see lots of parallels in terms of individual depression and generalized political passivity. What is happening that is pacifying huge numbers of people? Are they completely broken, or are they just somewhat demoralized, or are they just completely apathetic, or do they care but they've got no energy or they've got no hope? One of the first things that I do in this book is to take a look at what are the different areas, and they're across the political spectrum. So folks who are normally on the left, liberals, they're very comfortable with the idea of talking about how consumerism has broken folks, how greed has broken, sort of what I call in the book like a kind of moneyism. They're comfortable even talking about how corporations and the media have propagandized people and have socially isolated people, and suburbs and car culture, and all of those things are hugely important. But there's other issues I think sometimes folks, for example, on the left there, are not so crazy to talk about, that are also breaking people, which are normally considered left institutions, but are really not functioning in any kind of, they're functioning more to break people than to create more satisfying human lives. Those institutions are schools. There's all these wonderful teachers in these places who really care about learning, but the institutions themselves are mostly all about getting young people to follow orders and be compliant. And that's really what school does best. It takes a population and gets it to comply and follow orders. Yes, some learning goes on there, but mostly the major piece of learning is compliance. And so the more that you foster a society to feel like there's something deeply problematic about itself if it doesn't, have at least a high school degree, a college degree, an MA, Ph.D., you've also now created like a hierarchy that makes a whole bunch of people who aren't at the very top. I guess at the top is what, I don't know, Ph.D., M.D., I don't know how many degrees you have to be at the top of that hierarchy, or else you're inferior. You get to vote for a Republican, and what do? You get senseless wars and corporate control. Well, I'll vote for a Democrat. Guess what? You get senseless wars and corporate control. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to vote for a third party. I'm going to vote for whatever, maybe the Green Party or something else. Well, guess what? Republicans or Democrats are still going to win, and you get senseless wars and corporate control. Or, you know what? I'm not going to vote. Screw them. To hell with all of them. I'm going to stay at home, and I'm not going to vote. What do you get? Corporate control, and senseless wars. So, that is a learned helplessness thing for lots of folks out there. What is it going to take for a population out there who are feeling demoralized, broken, de-energized? What are the things that they're going to need? At one time, actually, there were historians in America who were looking at great democratic movements, who were analyzing them and trying to figure out what did these people have that these other people don't have? Is it just really an issue that a lot of people like to believe, well, if things get crappy enough and they get rotten enough, then certainly there'll be a revolution. Well, that's really not the case. When people have what the great populist historian Goodwin has called individual self-respect and collective confidence, that's when you see people take action. Well, what the heck can we do to restore that, or to get people their individual self-respect or their self-respect? How can we get that back? How can we get back this thing that he calls collective self-confidence, which is just the belief that people feel that they can actually win, that they can actually take back some control over their life? What are those things that can create that? And so that's what I care about, just like I care about on an individual level. There's some things that are parallel for a group, for a population, but some things that are a little bit different. So some of the things that parallel for an individual is just this whole area of how does a group get their morale back? How does a group get energy? How do people within that group heal and feel whole? Some of those things parallel that. But other things, there are other areas too that have to do with how do people unify? How do people, learn how to form those kinds of relationships again, where they're not taking seriously minor differences and focusing on what they have that are hugely important in common? What can people do who are not completely passive and helpless and demoralize themselves to help folks get that morale back, get that energy, also to help them unify themselves to gain greater strength? That's what I care about, and bringing that out of the individual personal realm to the larger group, as I see American society becoming more of a lot of it becoming a society that's moved into the psychology of the oppressed, or this fatalism, or what Bob Marley called mental slavery. There's lots of different terms for that, and that's where we're moving. And I really am concerned. I really care about us beginning this discussion here and coming up with solutions for this problem.